Hello and welcome to the second part of our Great Central Railway model railway layout build. You join us here back at the Great Central Railway today, but more importantly, we're ready for the next phase of our layout build. We're going to start laying some track.
Which means we can get trains running.
Absolutely, the most important part, I think, of any model railway layout build is getting the trains running.
Right, so remind people at home where they can see the step-by-step guide.
So you can see full guides to our Great Central layout build in the 2021 and 2022 Hornby Magazine yearbooks, which are available to buy from shop.keypublishing.com. And you can see all that right here on keymodelworld.com as well.
Right, so I think you better get on with some track laying.
Definitely, because I want to recreate that.
The Great Central Railway is the UK's only double-track mainline heritage railway. It's the only heritage line where full-size steam engines can be seen passing each other at speed, just as it was when steam ruled the rails. Join the Hornby Magazine team as they embark on building a brand new 00 gauge layout. Come with us as we visit the railway and explore new techniques in this all-new 4-part series. Building the Great Central Railway.
Hello and welcome back to the Hornby Magazine workshop for the second part of our Great Central Railway layout build. In the first part we showed you how we built the baseboards using Hatton's new MDF laser cut baseboards. Having got them assembled, painted all the baseboards as well so they're ready to lay track, we're ready to move on to the next phase of this project. Now in difference to how we built layouts before here at Hornby Magazine, we're going to be using Peco's new bullhead rail track. Now the biggest improvement with that is that we now get scale sleeper spacing as well. So rather than having compacted sleeper spacing like we got on the previous Code 75 flat bottom rail, which has been the hallmark of many of our exhibition layouts, we've now got proper sleeper spaces, which is really going to look the part underneath the trains on this layout. Now at the moment, Peco produces yard lengths of bullhead track, as well as a left-hand and right-hand large radius point. But it's also got additional points in production at the moment, including a diamond crossing, a single slip, a double slip, as well as medium radius points too. We're also going to be using the new bullhead rail joiners that Peco's produced for this track system as well. They've got some really nice bolt head detail on them too, and look much more like a scale rail joining you see on a real piece of railway track. Plus, as a final finishing touch from that bullhead rail range, we've also got the new rail-built buffer stops that Peco have produced in plastic. Like all of our layouts, the track's going to be laid on a cork base. So that cork's going to lift the track off the baseboard, and that's going to do two things. One, it's going to give us a nice ballast shoulder when it comes to ballasting the track bed, and secondly, it's also going to give a little bit of sound deadening as well, although some of that effect is taken away by the ballasting. Handily as well, it will raise the track height as well, which will be really good for coming through this station here and to match the height of the platforms to the trains. Right, introductions out of the way, it's time to get cracking, show you how the track goes together, and then we can start laying the track here for Quorn Magna, and you'll see that coming together. Soon though, we'll be able to run some trains. So we just started to lay out the first yards of track for Quorn Magna Station here using the Peco bullhead track. And the methods you're going to use are identical whatever type of track you're going to be laying. So there's a few main tools you're going to need to do this. So I always have my slitting disc in a mini drill, which I use to cut rail ends. We've got a craft knife, which I use to cut sleeper web when I need to. We've got a pin hammer to hammer in the pins to hold the track into place. We've also got a pair of pliers, which is just a useful handy tool to have around to help adjust track into position around curves and to put track into rail joiners as well. Now with any layout, one of the most important things is to work out where to start with your actual build. And for me, it was this corner here, because this part here is critical to the design of the whole layout. So if I get this curve here wrong coming into the station, everything else is going to go wrong as well. So it was really important to me to get a nice blended curve coming around here, and we've got quite a wide spread of the two tracks in the station. So they're going to come round to join each other, and they'll be back to a normal formation and spread between the rails over in this corner behind me. Now the reason this is so important to get right here is I've got to have enough space to get this curve in without making it too tight for the trains. So I've made sure my buildings are set in the right place. I've got the full length of platform that I need, with importantly for this layout, for it to break down into sections, so that the section break of the baseboard is between two sections of platform as well. Talking of baseboard breaks, one of the other things we're going to have to cope with this layout is the point where we separate the two baseboards from each other. Now in order to do that, we always put what's called a copper clad sleeper at the end of the rail, so that goes across the edge of the baseboard joint. Now to make this even easier with this layout, we're actually using DCC Concepts pre-cut sections of etched sleeper, which have got solder pads on them too. And that makes it a really quick, simple process to add those points of contact to the end of the rails. Now what that really does, it doesn't provide any means of providing electricity, although you could use it for that purpose as well. But what it really does, it provides a firm anchor point for the rails at the end of any baseboard joint. And that means that whilst the board's in transit, the rail ends are definitely going to stay in the same place when we come to put the boards back together next time. We'll show you that process a bit later in the build, but for now we're going to focus on getting the cork down, getting this first section of track into place, and making it ready to run a train on. So construction of Quorn Magna Station and its track plan is coming along quite nicely now. We've got both main lines laid through the platforms around the wide island platform. We've also got the approach curves laid quite nicely here as well. We've got that characteristic split of the two main lines as they approach a London Extension station on the GCR. Now a couple of things to point out with this layout as well. One, in order to make the track the right height so the platforms sit at the correct height against the coach, we've had to use 2 layers of 1/16 inch cork here underneath the section through the station. So that's made it an 1/8 inch cork. So if you are planning to use these stations, you might want to look at using some 1/8 inch cork as you come through the platform area, or for the whole layout if you wish. What I've done at the end of each of those sections is I've just allowed the line to tail off down to the 1/16 level, which will be no problem at all for any of the locomotives. And all that slack will be taken up when we come to ballast the layout as well. Added to that, I've also cut out the sleepers where I'm going to have baseboard joints, so I can put in copper clad sleepers to replace those plastic sleepers, which will give us a firm base to anchor the track to at the baseboard joints. And we're now ready to start moving on to the next phase of the layout's construction, which is where the lines come back together again after the end of the platforms. And we've got our first point in as well, and that's going to lead into a goods loop that's going to sit alongside this inner circuit main line here as well. And that will give us a nice way of holding a goods train next to a passenger train as it comes into the station. One other thing to point out is as well, that being a model railway, there's a couple of compromises we've got to make along the way. One of the primary ones of those in terms of the Great Central is that actually we've got curves where otherwise the railway would be straight. Now, if you've been to any of the preserved stations on the Great Central Railway between Loughborough and Rothley, you'll notice that actually pretty much all of those are dead straight on their approach to the station. There's a slight curve coming down to Rothley from Swindon sidings, but again, it's a very gentle curve, not any kind of model railway curve. However, in order to fit into the 16-foot by 8-foot continuous run circuit that we've got here for Quorn Magna and our Swindon sidings sections, it does mean we're going to have curves where otherwise there wouldn't be. However, it's a compromise I'm quite willing to accept in order to run some nice scale link trains through this station. Right, on to the next section. I'm going to show you a bit more detail about how I've laid the track and some of the details you need to look at if you're laying your own track as well. I've completed what I call the easy part of this layout, which is basically being plain line running through the station, which has brought it down to this board here, which has got the most complicated part of this layout's track plan on it. Now the Great Central Railway is quite a simple line really. It was a double track main line with a handful of sidings off here and there, a goods loop as well in places, and also some lie-by sidings where freight trains would reverse in to allow other trains to pass them. Now I'm trying to replicate all of that, but also want to include the crossover that was quite prevalent in the station track plans, which allowed trains to come in, set back, and then pull forward to use the goods yard as well for shunting. Now, getting all that to fit into a layout that's only 16 foot long and maintaining a platform that's long enough for a 6-coach train, that's been a bit of a squeeze. So like I was explaining earlier, we have got some curves and compromises in the arrangement of the track plan, and that's one of the things I've had to work on here. Another thing I've had to work on here is working the point motor positions around the baseboard frame as well. So one of the key things you don't want to do is end up with a point positioned where the point motor is going to interfere with part of the framework of the baseboard, because we don't want to be cutting that away. So I've had a few goes at arranging the points here, and I've got to an arrangement eventually which now pretty much works, give or take, within about ½ an inch of where I actually want it to be in the end. So we're ready to start cutting the track here and joining it all together. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the cutting disc in a mini drill to start cutting sections of track to fit to where we want them to be. And then we're going to slide a piece of cork underneath all this and then start laying out the point motor holes as well. So if you stick with us, we'll show you how that's all done and we can get closer to getting this layout running. We now need to mark the position of the frog switch wires as well, and they are reasonably easy to find on these points, so they usually stick out a little bit. And the 4 sleeper back. So you're going to mark the outer ends of those positions. So what I'll use the centre point between those 2 marks I've made at either end of those sleepers to position the hole for the point frog wire as well. Right, so terrible though it may seem, we'll put all that effort into laying this neat piece of track work out. We're going to take all this piece off now, and then we're going to reinstate it back onto here in a moment when we've drilled all those holes. Take all that off, move it to one side. Now, another little thing I like to do is I run the pen down to the centre of where each of those marks were for the point tie bars. Because again, it gives me another really good indication of where the hole is, because sometimes it can be difficult to find them after you've made them. We also need to mark a hole at the centre of each one of those pairs of dots as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make those holes first, and these are the ones for the frog switching wire. It's very simply 2mm drill hole through each of those positions. And then to make it easier to make the hole for the point motors, what I do is I cut out a small square or rectangle, depending on how accurate I am at the time, of the cork, and that reveals the hole that I made with the tip of that track pin before. So that gives me the centre point for me to use a 10mm drill in order to drill a hole for the point motor there. So no need to worry about perfection there, because all that will be hidden under the points anyway. So now on the 10mm drill, I'm using the hole made by the track pin. I'm just going to use that to line up the tip of the drill. Now, one thing to note is, being a wood bit, it's got a nice sharp point on the end, and that means it's going to be really easy to line up with that point as well. So I'm going to do these points one at once, so we can show you the frog wires as well whilst we're installing those. So as you turn the point over, on the underside, you've got this wire here. At the moment, that wire is connected to nothing, so that central part of the point frog there is not powered at all, unless this wire is connected back to a frog switch. So that wire is going to go through the first hole we made, the 2mm hole. Slide that through it and join it onto the piece of track coming from there. Same again with the next point. So I'm going to detach it from its other rail it's already on. Follow that as frog wire. Feed that through its hole in the baseboard and line the points up with the rail joiners on its mainline track there. Now, the other critical thing to make sure is that as you put each of these points back in position, that the central hole in the tie bar does go over the place where you wanted it to. If it doesn't, then you have problems, because your point motor won't line up. Okay, and it's time for our third and final point now, this small section of the junction. Feed that through the hole in the baseboard. And then we've got to line up all 4 rails this time. Just usually a little bit more tricky than 2, for obvious reasons. Again, what we're going to do now is tack all this track into place around the points so they can't go anywhere. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to move on and start doing the rest of the track, get the rest of this junction into position, start laying the main line around the rest of the layout, and hopefully soon we have some trains running around this layout. Well, as you've just seen, it's been a pretty intensive track laying session to get all of the double track main line laid around our GCR layout. But as you can see now as well, it is complete, trains are running as well, and we've got a working layout, which is a really brilliant stage to reach with any project. It's one of the things actually that when people ask me about building layouts, I always say to them, you need to get trains running. It's a really good reward when you start working on layouts to reach a point where you can have some trains running and see movement on the layout. Now at the moment, it's just got a temporary power feed in where I put a baseboard connection over the far side of the layout there, and that means it's been connected into a GaugeMaster Prodigy controller in order to provide DCC power to the track. Now one of the things I'm really pleased with as well is that the Unifrog points from Pico, well, I'm actually really impressed with them because they've reduced the amount of wiring I need, they've reduced the need to put insulated rail joiners in, and actually I think as well, the bullhead track with its scale sleeping spacing, it looks really good on this layout too, and that's even before we started ballasting it as well. So obviously there's still more to do. I've got a dual track main line, I've got some point work behind me at the junction, but actually we've got more to do to bring this layout together. Now the next stage that I'm going to be working on is installing the track work for the goods yard and also the goods loop on this side by the station. And then once we've done all that, I've also got all the rest of the loops to lay for the swivel and sidings area on the other side of the layout. Now you can just see there I've put the first point in, but there are more points to go in there to create basically it'll be a sort of a pseudo 4-track section through there, just like it is at Swidland today. Then we'll have all the rest of the sidings to put in later. Now I'm not going to do all that right away, because we're going to focus on Quad Magna for the time being and getting that all built up and finished. So having said all that, the next stage I've got to move on to, after we finish the track laying here, is to start doing the underboard electrics as well. So I've got to install the power buses to provide the power to the points and to the running lines as well, and also all the baseboard connections to allow the baseboards to be separated. And that's the next step we're going to take after we finish the track, which I'm going to do now. But just for the fun of it, I'll leave a couple of trains running whilst I enjoy laying that track as well. So that's now brought us to the end of the track laying phase here on Quorn Magna. So I've got all the main lines laid, I've got the goods loop laid where the O4 is currently sat, and I've laid 2 sidings in the goods yard as well. So that's given us plenty of operational value here on the layout, especially with that nice junction on the approach to the station just beyond the platforms where the B1's about to pass. So like I explained earlier, my next step is now to go and start inserting the copper clad sleepers, which are going to prepare the baseboard joints on the track for when we need to separate the baseboards. For that, we're going to be using DCC Concepts pre-etched sleepers, and they're a really useful piece of equipment to use to actually make those baseboard joints solid and sturdy for any transport required for this layout. They come on a fret, which means you can snap them off quite easily. We're going to show you how to use those next. Okay, so this is the product we're going to be using. These are the DCC Concepts pre-etched and pre-cut sleepers. Now they've got solder spacers on each one as well, which means they're also electrically isolated, which is really handy. So no more scoring of the top of copper clad panels or anything like that to worry about. So once you get that sheet out of the box, you get a sheet like this, which just looks like a whole load of sleepers, and they're the same length as the sleepers on the track as well. So all we've got to do is cut these off here, drill a couple of holes in one in each end of each sleeper so we can pin it to the baseboard, and then solder them to the rails. And that's going to give us a nice solid permanent baseboard joint for the track. So literally all I'm going to do is I'm going to use a pair of side cutters, and these are from the DCC Concepts range, to snip off the sleepers. Now we cut these off the fret, we can clean up the little tabs on them, and then we're going to drill 2 holes in the side, like I said. Then once these are in place, they give us a really secure fixing point for the track at the end of each baseboard. Because without these, if you just relied on the plastic sleepers, if we took this layout apart and transported it around, without these, there's a high chance of us damaging the ends of the rails. And that's what they're really here for, is to make sure those rails stay exactly where we want them to. So when we bring the 2 baseboards back together again, that not only does the baseboard line up, all the tracks line up as well at the same time. So it's a really important feature of a portable layout to do this. If you aren't building a portable layout, you can skip this step and move on to the next bit and move on to just the plain old wiring to get it all working. Okay, so our next step is going to be to drill 2 holes in the end of each one of these sleepers, and that's so we can put some track pins through to firmly hold them to the baseboard. So I'm using a Dremel mini drill with a 1mm drill bit in it, and we're going to just make those holes now. So those 2 holes now are going to be big enough for us to put a track pin through the end of this. And the reason it's on a block of wood here is I don't want to drill loads of tiny holes into my baseboard. And it's just handy to have some scrap wood like this hanging around in your workshop, which you'll find 1,000,001 uses for this, where you need to drill holes into things. So that'll be staying with us throughout this whole series. I've already cut away the plastic sleeper webbing on the Pico track to make space for these new pre-etched sleepers to go into place. So now all we've got to do is we've got to slide each one of these underneath the rails into position, and I'm aiming for sort of the same sort of sleeper spacing that we're getting on the track originally. And it's a case of using a couple of track pins, one in each side of this sleeper. And these are just going to hold it firmly in place on the baseboard. You need to make sure they're quite firm as well, because if there's too much movement, then it won't hold your track quite perfectly in place. Do the same to the other side of the baseboard joint as well. Make sure you don't hit the track as well, because that will damage the railhead if you hit the track with this hammer. Okay, so that's one track done. Slide them through on the next one as well. So you will find where you've got angled track joints that sometimes you either need to use more sleepers and extra pins in them, then cut them with the direction of the baseboard joint, or you just have to make a slight compromise on your sleeper spacing in order to make them fit, which is basically what I'm doing here. So I've got a little bit of extra space between these couple of sleepers. If I just set this one in place and drop the next one in, we're not far off the same sleeper spacing as the original Pico track. But it's just probably a little bit further apart on the actual two etched sleepers either side of the joint here. So now we've got those pre-etched sleepers fitted to the baseboard joint, our next job's going to be use the soldering iron to solder the rails to those sleepers. And that's going to give us a really strong bonding point for the rails at the end of each baseboard. And then once that's done, we can cut the track, and then we'll take the baseboard apart and bring it back together again. Those tracks will always be in line when they join up there. Okay, so we're now ready to move on to the wiring process of the layout, which is a process I know not many people are always that comfortable with. So we're going to try and do this in simple steps to guide you through each stage of it. So on the layout in front of me, I've got all the pieces that we need to make that wiring jigsaw work. So we've got a heavy-duty cable, which is for our main bus cable, which runs around the layout from the controller to provide power to the layout. We've got thin 7-strand 0.2mm equipment wire, which provides the droppers from the track down to that power bus. And then we've got these plug-in terminal blocks, which are used to make the baseboard joins and to provide a point where we can connect the equipment wire back to the main bus cable. All modern railway wiring is actually quite simple. It's basically a case of repeating the same circuit over and over again. In terms of building a DCC layout, it gets even simpler. So we've got on the layout here, we've laid out the main components of what we'd require to go underneath the baseboard, just as an example of connecting one pair of tracks back to it. So this main white cable here is the bus cable. So that's your main power source running from your controller all the way around the layout and providing a point to connect connections for the track back to. Okay, so we would have a wire coming from the back of the controller, which would run round and join to this plug-in terminal block here. That would then be plugged into this next chocolate block, which gives you the link into the power bus, which then runs all the way through your layout baseboard over to another chocolate block at the next baseboard. Now again, if you're not making a modular layout where you don't need to separate it down, then you don't need to have the separate connections at every baseboard. Although, having said that, at the same time, in terms of future-proofing the layout, it may be worth doing as well, just in case you have to move it at some point. So going back to the first connection point to this side, I've then put a piece of equipment wire, black and red wire here, next to it as well. So those two wires will be soldered to the rails. They'll go through small holes in the baseboard surface, and then they'll be connected into that same terminal block to provide the power source to these rails. That power source will then provide power to this section of track from this baseboard joint here through to the next baseboard joint. And of course, we've got to cut the rails at each end of the baseboard to make this a modular layout. We then have to do the same again on the next baseboard. So you then have another chocolate block on this side of the baseboard, which would have wires coming out of it to connect to each section of track. Now, because it's DCC powered, we only need one chocolate block. So we only need one pair of wires running around the whole layout, and that powers everything. If you're going to do this with analog, then you need a separate pair of wires to a separate pair of chocolate blocks for each circuit of the layout. One area where you can add more flexibility with a DCC layout, and it's sometimes a good idea, again, for thinking about the future of a project, is to provide a separate power bus for your points and accessories. So we're going to do that as well for this layout. So this will have two power buses running underneath it, one for the track power, and one for the point power. Now that point power is going to be running, at the moment for the time being, direct from the same power source, but it just means that again, in the future, if we want to, we can then add a separate power source to run those points. Right, that's the basics. We're now going to move on and show you exactly how to do this on the layout. Okay, so we're now going to actually connect a pair of dropper wires onto the rails, and I'm going to show you above the baseboard how they go together into the chocolate block as well. And then what we'll show you after that is actually how it looks underneath when we fit it properly as well. The first thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to move these components out of my way. So going to need 2 holes through the cork between a pair of sleepers. So those 2 holes provide the route for these 2 wires, the black and red wires, your dropper wires, to go down from the rail underneath the baseboard to connect to that chocolate block. Next thing we need to do is we need to bare the ends of each of these wires. So I always take off about 15 millimeters of insulation off one of these dropper wires. The reason for that is it then looks a lot neater. So once you've taken it off, because we're using multi-core equipment wire, which is the best for doing dropper wires with because it's got flexibility, those need twisting together to make a firm piece of wire like that. I then put a tiny fold at the end of it. It's about the last 4 or 5 millimeters, 6 millimeters the most of the wire is at right angles to the point where it comes in. Let's do that again with the other one. Okay, so our next step now is to do what's called tinning of the wires. And what that means is it means loading the wire with solder. Now, when I say loading, I don't mean putting massive blobs of solder on. I just want that bare wire to be coated in solder. Do the same with the other one. Just a light coat of solder all the way down that bare piece of wire. Next, we'll repeat that tinning process with the rail that we're going to solder it onto as well. So, just a little bit of heat on the side of the rail. Introduce a little bit of solder, not too much. You don't want great big blobs. Same again on the other side. Right, we're now ready to make the connection. So the reason I tin the wire and the rail is that it means that now when you come to this next process, you only need 2 hands. If you had to introduce solder, hold the wire and hold the soldering iron all at the same time, you'd just find you don't have enough hands and it's not going to be very enjoyable to do then. So all we've got to do now is hold this wire against the rail, heat the wire and the solder on the rail at the same time. Connection done. Hold it for a few seconds whilst the solder sets. Let go. Give it a tug to make sure it's set properly, and do the other side. Same again. A little bit of heat. Join the wire and the solder together. Let it set for a few seconds. Give it a tug to make sure it's got set on there properly, and that's our dropper wires connected. So every single rail side joint for a dropper wire is done the same way. All that is now is repeating this process many times over on this layout to actually make all the same type of connection. So what we would do then normally is I'd get the end of this wire, I'd thread it into the hole in the baseboard I just made, and I'd put it through all the way until it was nice and neat. I'm just going to show you. So you go, your wire's pretty much invisible now, and that's why I take off 15 millimeters of insulation. So it means then that we haven't got a big chunk of insulated wire sticking out the top of the baseboard surface there. So it minimises the impact of that wire in terms of the visual appearance of the layout. Now you could take this a step further. If you wanted to go for really neat wiring, you could actually take out the sleeper webbing underneath and solder these wires on underneath the rails. Now that's if you want to go for the best possible looking of design of your track. This way, it's a little bit of a shortcut. It's a little bit easier, and it also means that you can lay your track, then wire it, then move on to the next stage of scenery and development. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to separate the 2 wires at the end so we can connect them to the chocolate block to start making our bus wire connection. So use a pair of side cutters or wire cutters, just cut between the 2 lengths of wire and then split them for about 3 or 4 centimeters so you've got enough wire to work with. Then use the wire strippers to bare the end of the wire again like you did before. And this time I'm looking for about 10 millimeters of bare wire on these. Okay, so that's our bare bus wire ready to be connected into that chocolate block. But what we're not going to do is not going to twist those together straight away. So what we'll do now, instead, is we'll bare the end of this black wire first. And then we can twist that onto the bus wire, like this. We can do the same with the red wire. Twist it together. And that's going to make a really simple way of connecting all these dropper wires to your power bus. Because all you've got to do now is line those up with the holes in the back of the chocolate block and use the screw terminals to fix them down into place. Now, as things stand, I'm not actually going to put those screw terminals down, because the next thing we've got to do is we've got to go and repeat this process, like I said, of putting the dropper wires on each of these pairs of rails. So they're all going to drop through the baseboard, and we're going to join them all to this one same chocolate block to take power into all the track on this board. Okay, so we've finished the wiring underneath the board, we've put all the droppers in, and it's all connected up and ready to go. So we're going to do that all important fun part now of layout building and give it a test run. And I've brought out an 8F from the collection, so we can give it a little test with a sound loco as well. So that brings us to the end of the second part of our Great Central Railway build series. We hope you enjoyed the video and also seen how simple it can be to lay track and wire it up as well. Obviously, we're enjoying running the trains now as well, with the whole layout working, and Richard's really been enjoying being able to get his hands on a controller and run some 00 gauge trains again. So next time when you join us, we'll be moving on to the next stage in the project. So that's going to move on to weathering the track, ballasting it, and also the first stages of landscaping. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.
Next time on Building the Great Central Railway, join Mike and Richard as they embark on adding the scenery for the new 00 gauge layout.
It's now time for the interesting bit, which is all the scenery.
From track weathering, ballasting,
Nearly 11 o'clock at night, we're still ballasting. How do you feel?
to ground cover. With deadlines looming, has the team bitten off a new technique too many?
Is it not working?
No.
Good idea?
No.
Find out in the next episode of building the Great Central Railway. Only available on keymodelworld.com.